There's a story about Pope John the 23rd. Pope John the 23rd had been elected bishop and become a pope actually at that point. And the story goes that his first audience was coming to greet him and to meet him, and the first visitors. And among the very first visitors to come and greet him, one of the visitors was his mother. His mother was a woman who had lived most of her life on the edge of poverty, if not in poverty. And so she came to visit her son, who is now Pope. Imagine that. She came to visit him, and she came into that greeting area, the reception area where they were going to greet him. And as she entered into that area, it was so elaborately decorated, and it was a place like she'd never seen before. And she was just sort of taken in with it all. And she comes in to greet her son, and she's with this group. And they usher them all inside, and each person comes forward and kneels before the Pope and then kisses his ring. Each person does that. Well, she comes forward finally when it's her turn, and she kneels before her son. She acknowledges his spiritual authority in her life in that kneeling. But then she does something different. She holds out her hand, her ring, and she says, "Now, son, kiss my ring. For if it were not for this ring, you would not be wearing that ring." It's always important to keep things in perspective. It's important to keep things in perspective. When I first entered the candidacy for ministry many years ago and started this process, I had lots of advice. I had lots of free, unsolicited advice given to me. Lots of it. And some of it was pretty good from ministers and laity as well. Lots of advice. And one of the bits of advice I remember from way back in that point was this advice about how to preach. He told me, always begin where people are with your sermons. Begin where they are. Begin where people are. Begin with people's problems. Always begin there, and then move to the biblical text for their solution. That was the model of preaching that he had been a part of. The response to their human problems, their real problems, and their everyday problems in life, that method works somewhat. But I'm not sure it works with the text from today so well. How do we connect today's gospel lesson, the Sermon on the Mount or the Beatitudes, how do we connect that with our lives? The great preacher Barbara Brown Taylor says this about the Sermon on the Mount or the Beatitudes. She says, it can be summed up in this little phrase: blessed are the upside down. Think about that a minute. Blessed are the upside down. That may be the best translation of the Beatitudes I've ever heard. The Beatitudes speak about the world seen from a different perspective than most of us are used to. A different place to take the stand. Upside down from the way we usually envision the world, the way we usually understand the world, looking, if you will, from the bottom side up. Bottom side up. Taylor says that when Jesus preached the Beatitudes, he should have had the crowd stand on their heads. I don't know if there's any volunteers here today to stand on your head. I never was good at that. I kept falling over, so I didn't think I'd do that today. Because she says that's what Jesus was doing. When he preached this sermon on the Beatitudes, Jesus was standing on his head. Jesus was asking them to turn the known world upside down. That's what he was asking them to do. To turn this known world, the world they'd known, the world they'd grown up in, the world they'd lived in for however many years, to take that and just turn it upside down. To view the world from a totally different direction. To give themselves an utterly different worldview. A new direction. A new way to take the stand. Matthew's gospel begins strangely enough, though. It begins, of course, with the virgin birth. And then it gets even stranger because it begins to tell us things like turn the other cheek, to go the second mile, to pluck out an eye if you look lustfully. I mean, you can browse the internet. I know some of you do. You can browse it a long time. You're not going to hear advice like that. I'm sorry. It's not there. This not real life, we live it. It's not the real world advice that we seek, is it? To pluck your eye out if you look lustfully or turn the other cheek. Yet Jesus thinks, when he says those words, Jesus thinks he's addressing everyday life. Everyday life. His advice is very practical. What do you do when people offend you? Turn the other cheek. What do you do when your marriage goes bad? What do you do when you feel lost? Perhaps our problem with this text is not that it's not the real world. Perhaps it is advice we really don't want. Maybe we really don't want this advice. Here in the inner contradictions of our world, we call one another fools in various ways. We do lie, we do swear, we do lust, we do cheat. And he is talking about me, and he's talking about you when he says these things. He's talking about every Christian whose sex life is separate from their spiritual life. He's talking about every Christian who cannot turn the other cheek, but instead turns to an attorney to get retribution. He's talking to us. He's challenging us to take the stand in a different way from the way this world would tell us to do it. He's calling each of us as Christians to take that stand differently than this world would tell us to do that. Now, this is all beginning to sound like a sermon, isn't it? We say, well, now don't you preach at me, preacher, okay? Preach at someone else, that guy over there, he needs it, but not me. Well, the world, or Webster, defines preaching as an annoying harangue. An annoying harangue. It says to preach is to give religious advice, especially, get this, I love this part, in a tiresome manner. Yeah. That's what I do every Sunday. To give advice in a tiresome manner. You see, the Sermon on the Mount, though, is not that kind of sermon. It's not that kind of preaching. The one who preached this sermon did not preach it from a high, lofty pulpit somewhere. He preached it in a field. He preached to the multitudes of people that had gathered there. And he preached. Yes, he did preach. And when he enacted it in his very blood, then he went and enacted it in his very blood as he took the stand on a cross. See, the sermon is not mere rules. It's the way this preacher, Jesus, took the stand. This is the way he took the stand. This is the way he walked the walk, if you will, before he asked us to stand with him, to walk with him. This is the way he modeled it. We're conditioned, I know, to hear sermons as more rules, more unattainable rules out there, ideals, if you will. Who has not murmured under their breath, fool, when confronted by a neighbor's weakness? Who has not lusted in the heart or elsewhere? I remember many years ago hearing a sermon at camp. I heard a sermon at camp, and the text was this one about plucking out the eye and chopping off a limb, and the sermon was a sermon to a bunch of senior high kids, and this guy was really honest. He got up in front of all these kids, and he stood before them, and he said to you, "I stand before you today as a one-eyed, one-armed preacher." And don't we all? Such rules are set too high. They're unattainable. They might lead you to a point of grief. Whenever this sermon once must not be what the world calls happiness. Whatever this sermon wants must not be what the world calls peace. Whatever this sermon wants must not be what the world calls well-being. So what does the Sermon on the Mount want? I think it wants to give us not so much rules. I don't think it wants to give us a huge moral burden. I think it wants to give us a whole new world. That's what the Sermon on the Mount wants to give us. A whole new world, a whole new life. A new life in a world which we would not have without Jesus. It wants to give us a whole new life and a whole new world that we could never imagine, that we would never have without Jesus. Here is a sermon that doesn't speak to where you are. It calls us to a place that you and I might go with Jesus. A place that we might make the stand with Jesus. The sermon begins with these words: "Blessed are the poor in spirit." That's how it begins. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Aren't we all? Aren't we all? Who among us today has all the spirit they need for the rest of their lives? None of us do. You see, this first verse promises us a blessing. It promises us a blessing. How do these high, difficult demands mean blessing, though? They seem so high. They seem so difficult. They seem so unattainable. How can they be blessing? Well, let me tell you another story. Way back when I was in high school, my junior year, I had a wonderful English literature teacher, Mr. Simmons. Mr. Simmons was a great teacher, but he started out, and it was sort of a strange way to start an English literature class. It seemed like he wanted to give us an unbearable amount of English history for some reason. I wasn't sure if I was in English history class or English literature class for a while. I mean, we learned about kings and queens and dates and battles and strange sounding places. And day after day, it was the Tudor and the Stuarts and the Roundheads and the Tories and and what was I going to do with all that? What were we all going to do with all that? Living in Bartlesville, Oklahoma in 1978, it didn't make a lot of sense. Well, one day, someone in the class got their gumption up, if you will. I mean, these were 17-year-olds. We were 17. We had a lot of gumption at that point. Anyway, they got their gumption up, and they said to Mr. Simmons, I think you're teaching a bunch of irrelevant stuff to us. You know. Well, Mr. Simmons, our teacher, his eyes got cloudy, which was a bad sign, and he stepped over to the window. You ever had a teacher step over to the window? That's when you're going to really hear something. He said, in college, a group of us went to London. We went to London for a whole month, and we went to the Tate Gallery and Parliament and St. Paul's Cathedral, and we saw everything in London. We took it all in. He said, I felt the history. I felt the glory of it all. And he said, someday I hope each of you will get a chance to go there, just like I did. And I want you to love it as much as I loved it. That's the key phrase. The words I haven't forgotten. I want you to love it as much as I loved it. You see, Jesus here has not given us more impossible rules to follow. I mean, we broke the rules before we ever had Jesus, so why do we need more rules to break? Jesus here is on a journey, and he seems to want to go with us. He seems to want to invite us to go along with him on this journey. But before we go, he wants to paint us a beautiful picture of where we're going. Moreover, he does not go and hand us a map and says, good luck, you're on your own. No, he goes with us all the way. Jesus says, let people see your good works so they may give God the glory. Let people see your good works so they may give God the glory. I mean, people look, maybe people look at the way you live. Maybe people look at the way you forgive. Maybe people look at the way you love your neighbors and then say, the light of God really does shine through that one, doesn't it? Glory to God. Glory be to God.